Shall I?
And you are live.
So we're back after a short break. Senate Education Committee on February 4th. I guess you know everybody in the room, John. So you introduce yourself, and we're talking about the topic for the next hour is school construction overview. So a little bit of history and a little bit of thinking about what we might do.
Okay, sounds good.
So thanks.
John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Good to see everyone. Sort of relieved that this got pushed to this week because last Friday I was hitting the wall. So hopefully I'm more lucid today. Let me screen share. School construction. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to try to give an overview with some history, state of the current law, and then some of the thinking that's currently animating or happening in the halls. I just came from House Education where I gave a walkthrough of the school construction working group proposed language, and I can talk to some of that proposal when we get to it, but I do want to make sure that I leave time for Chris, which I think is going to be more valuable than walking through language. I can always come back and talk through particular language. So, historical overview. We're talking about Title 16, existing Chapter 123. This is currently on the...
By the way, let me just take the rush off you, because actually our next people can't get here until almost 4, right? Yeah. So we have more time than I just said. We have an hour and a quarter.
We may have quite a lot of time.
Okay, so you don't have to rush.
So, as you guys will know, school construction right now is not exactly proceeding under a particular program, but it's not to say that the language doesn't exist. Title 16, Chapter 123 is on the books. It's just under moratorium. To talk about the actual history of school construction, I think it's nice to situate what the language says in really brief form, and then I will come back to it in a more detailed form. So this was created back in 1996, the School Construction Aid Program. It authorizes the treasurer to issue bonds to assist school districts. This is a point I would call out as being of particular importance, because what this means is that the state aid program essentially implicates or affects the state's bonding capacity. So that's had impacts on the state's ability to fund these pieces. And you'll be familiar with, for instance, CDAC recommendations about particular bonding that should happen in a year, or sort of permissible levels, acceptable levels that won't downgrade the state's credit rating. If you do an approach like what is currently on the books, which is authorizing the treasurer to issue bonds to assist school districts, that would have impacts on your bonding capacity, and there are ways potentially that you could avoid the same impact. So that's one key feature of the existing program, issuing bonds using state bonding capacity to assist school districts. It creates a 2-step application process for construction aid that's done by the school districts themselves, including approval by 2 different parties. So the Secretary of Education and the State Board of Education. That's a theme that I'm going to return to, but basically under existing law, these responsibilities are divvied up amongst different entities. And not only is that confusing, but it sometimes leads to places where it's unclear who would be handling particular pieces. So Secretary of Education and the State Board of Education. Task the State Board with prioritizing projects and annually making a funding request to the institutions committees. So under existing law, were this program in operation and not under moratorium, what you would see happening is each year the State Board would be coming in and going to House Corrections and Institutions and Senate institutions to make a funding request. And this would flow through the capital bill. So typically the school construction program has gone through the capital bill and not through, say, the education committees. The program awards aid as a percentage of eligible construction costs based on project type. So this is a key feature both of existing program and current proposals. The aid is available only for eligible construction costs. It's not the entire value of a particular project. It's those that meet particular parameters, and those parameters are spelled out in rule. Under the existing program, authorizes the Secretary of Education to grant aid to emergency projects, and this can be thought of as slightly different than that 2-step application process. And I would call out too that the emergency aid has persisted through the moratorium. So the broad program is not in place. but the Secretary of Education can currently grant aid to emergency projects up to $1 cap. And it also operates differently in that sense. Rather than providing a percentage of particular projects, it's a dollar amount that's provided.
Has that happened?
Yes, emergency aid is gone. Lastly, the program grants rulemaking power to the state board. And again, just to draw out some of the interesting duality of this structure. So you have the Secretary of Education making particularly approvals, but it may be under a set of rules developed by the state board. So that's just high-level overview of the existing program. I would note that, so that happened in the 90s. And then as you can see, in 2001, provisions were added for career technical education facilities. And then in 2003, further provisions to incentivize energy savings through energy performance contracting. For those of you who have been around, you will know that some of the incentives that were provided under the program for energy savings approached 100% levels of project costs. And some folks attribute some of the problems that happened with the state aid program to that change. I don't know that it's so clear, because if you think about the way that prioritization works, only a certain amount of dollars are made available, and then you choose to supply them to particular projects. But it's nice to call out, one thing you can just think about here is that if provisions have been added to address these particular issues, you can think of these as policy levers to achieve particular kinds of projects. If you want to incentivize energy savings, well, the state has done that in the past. If you want to incentivize building out your CTE centers, you can do that too. So policy levers can be built into and have been built into this system. So in practice, this created a program that provides construction aid awards in varying amounts to projects determined eligible by the Secretary, prioritized by the state board, and funds for which were appropriated by the General Assembly following recommendation by the Institutions Committee. So involving a lot of parties here to get to an end result. Prior to 2007, the legislature had been spending approximately 20% of capital funds, around $10 million a year, on school construction, and it also applied one-time general fund revenues to help pay down state obligations. But as everyone knows, the state fell behind, wasn't keeping up with those costs, and there was a report that came out in 2008 that reported a state obligation of $74 million. So that's backlog on those ongoing school construction projects at that time.
When you say in that second bullet, $10 million a year, that was in the capital bill as opposed to bonding.
So the capital bill relies on general obligation bonding, but it was proceeding through the capital bill. That was the deliberative process in the State House that was leading to the
$10 million in bonding capacity.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
And so that's that's great. So that's the outstanding obligation.
Yeah.
If I can sort of set context, 2007, 2008, Great Recession. Okay, that's the state government was struggling to fund itself, and this was the first one to go. One of the first ones to go.
Just a little snapshot here. This is from that report showing the ongoing construction aid required. And what you can see, this is from new projects under suspension for the 2007 capital bill. So this is right after the moratorium started. Outstanding obligations of the fiscal year 09, $53,779,000. And you can see it declining over time, catching up on the backlog as the state was anticipated to make funds available to cover those outstanding obligations. So what did the legislature do? In 2007, suspended state aid for most school construction. There are some exceptions. And then the intent was to use the suspension period, which was not, at least as I understand it, intended to last until today, to develop a sustainable plan for state aid. So there was a pause with the idea of developing a fix for this program. In 2008, extended that suspension while including measures to ensure districts could deduct approved spending from their excess spending calculations. So this is a way of ensuring that school districts that were continuing to provide funds to those school construction projects weren't being dinged for it, that they weren't being penalized effectively from the fact that they couldn't receive state funds. In 2009, clarified that a district could proceed with projects using funding outside that stream. And that's the way that it has currently been working under the moratorium, is that school districts are on their own in this process. In 2011, tasked the Agency of Education with providing a report on the costs of lifting the moratorium. 2013, expressed intent to maintain the suspension, so state obligations, and to pay out those state obligations by fiscal year 2016. And then finally, in that fiscal year 2016, did finally pay out the state's final aid obligations. So caught up on the backlog of projects for which there had been approved state aid. And since then, there has not been state aid going to these approved school construction projects, at least through this Chapter 123 process. But there has been, as we talked about, that emergency aid continuation.
What's ANR?
Agency of Natural Resources. Oh, so, I'm sorry. A and R. I was thinking you were on another slide. And I was like, okay, yes.
No, I was thinking the same thing.
Thank you. Yeah.
What was the answer?
Acts and resolves.
Okay.
So when we reference that's super helpful. A&R, it's just a way of referencing the law that passed in a particular year rather than a bill or a House number. So we could call them by the House or Senate number, which is frequently how it's done during the session, because we're talking about a bill that hasn't been enacted, but at the point that it's enacted, we have that supplied number. So like for the first one, number 52, that was your 52nd act passed in the 2007 year. And yes, and resolves. No, that's sometimes I forget, like especially start of a session, just the basics of the process. And trying to fit a bunch of things on the slide too. So current practice, what's happening? Moratorium continues. But as noted, the state has awarded emergency aid throughout the moratorium. But here's a key part of the existing Chapter 123. No state aid is available to projects arising from significant deferred maintenance. And that condition actually applies across the entirety of the chapter. It's not exclusive to the emergency piece. It applies to any particular project. So the way that you can think about this is if you turned on or lifted the moratorium on the existing chapter, a lot of the projects that you might expect to avail themselves of state aid wouldn't be eligible under existing law to receive that state aid, because I'm guessing, and this is an empirical guess, which is something I'm not meant to do as a lawyer, but I feel like there's been enough time to say a lot of the projects are going to be a result of significant deferred maintenance. And just to call out that phrase, it's actually something that's built out in state rules. So there's a definition that the State Board of Education has put out in its 6000 series, which is the series of rules that governs school construction. School districts may pursue construction projects on their own, but these projects affect the district's education spending and therefore flow through and impact property taxes across the state. I'm going to pause there if folks have questions. I know there's been a lot of talk about impacts on the ed fund, particularly given the thinking about education transformation of the whole system that's in place. But currently, as school districts are attempting to fund their school construction projects, that's affecting property tax rates across the state. And in particular, it's affecting that district. But it does affect the state as a whole. It's not exclusive to those districts because those funds are raised statewide. In 2018, the legislature authorized the secretary to accept applications for planning grants for capital construction that would result in consolidation and closure of at least one building, but didn't appropriate any funds to go through that process. So there have been efforts to think about how to remedy this problem, how to deal with aging infrastructure, how to think about schools regionally. And then in 2023, created a time-limited facilities master plan grant program to encourage the development of a supervisory union level vision for all school districts that meet the educational needs and goals of the supervisory union. So again, some kinds of higher level thinking, ensuring that, or trying to get at schools not operating as just a bunch of independent actors competing for the same funds. Current law. So we did the high level overview at the start of this, but I can dive a little bit deeper into the actual process. So under that Chapter 123, in Section 3448, we established the process for a school district to apply for state aid. First, there's a preliminary application, including information required by rule. The Secretary of Education is to review that application, consider a set of factors, including regional, economic, and educational suitability factors, and determine whether the application meets certain eligibility conditions. I can, time pending, pull up the actual statute so we can talk about those pieces, but just as a high level, the Secretary of Education is making a set of considerations. So thinking about particular pieces, regional concerns, economic efficiencies, and the like, but those are just considerations that the Secretary has to undertake. but there's also mandatory eligibility conditions that particular projects need to meet. And the secretary is checking that those are met in this preliminary application. The school district submits a final application at any point following that prelim.
What are some of those things? What are some of those mandatory?
Yeah, so under mandatory, the first piece of the mandatory conditions is fulfilling one of a set of 4 different needs. So things like, is the facility threatening the health and safety of students and folks working in the building? Is the building in a state of deterioration? So particular needs-based pieces. The other eligibility conditions are things like, I think of them as almost a narrow tailoring type fit. Could you have pursued this project outside this school construction process? It needs to be that the project you've developed is sort of necessary to achieve this. And then also that the proposed project is well fitted to the problem that you're trying to solve. You can't just say, well, we have these problems. It meets these particular needs assessments under your eligibility conditions. And yes, it's crafted in a way where we couldn't do it otherwise. But then the scope of the project is wildly beyond the bounds of what's necessary to remedy the problem. So there's a bit of a check on, are you fulfilling things that the state has recognized and designated as of particular need? And then have you made these kind of smart tightening approaches to your project to ensure that it's fitted to the problem you're trying to solve? I think that's I'm happy to flip to it, but I think that's not a nice way to describe what those eligibility conditions are meant to get at. The school district submits a final application following that prelim, and the state board, so different than the Secretary of Education. We talked about the Secretary of Education is the one reviewing that prelim. Now it's the state board looking at the final application. May approve the application, meeting specific functional requirements. So the first thing that the state board will check is whether the prelim was approved, and they're going to check to see whether the district has voted funds or authorized a bond for that project. Only if those conditions are met can the final application be approved. But there's additional functional considerations that the state board looks to. So things like, do you have construction managers in place? People who are competent to handle this project? Do you have a financing plan? Functional checks to ensure that this is something behind which state dollars belong.
State Board of Education.
Yes, under the current program, which admittedly hasn't been functioning since 2007. Following preliminary approval by the Secretary of Education and a vote, and we just discussed this, a vote to authorize those bonds, the state board places the school on a priority list. So the way to think about the first part, we talked about the application process, getting that approval, voting funds, making it through the funnel of your eligibility conditions, having functional pieces in place to ensure that this is a smart project for dollars to be behind. Even then, there's a question as to whom dollars will flow to. So you got to prioritize those projects because only a certain amount of funding is going to be made available. So under the program, the state board places the school on a priority list by assigning priority points. There's a need-based point system under this section 3448. First priority goes to emergency projects over 100,000. Second to projects addressing deterioration of the building or equipment with this 10K figure, and then remaining priorities kind of measure between those two. I would call out that this is not a built out, very extensive, using all your policy levers prioritization system. This is just a way of prioritizing particularly emergency needs. So whatever happens in this space, if there's appetite to tackle this problem, this is something that I would imagine you're likely to want to overhaul, just given that you're in a much different place now than when this system was formed. The state board, additionally, and we talked about this, makes an annual capital construction funding request to House Corrections and Institutions and the Senate Committee on Institutions. So going through that cap bill process, and the way that they do that is the state board would come in and have a list of line items, essentially, of those projects by priority. So the legislature would be receiving a prioritized list of projects, and then the cap bill process would resolve which particular projects receive funding. And if you really want like the deep history of this, I know that Rep. Emmons obviously went through a bunch of this, and yeah. Awarding state aid. So key part of this, the actual dollars flowing to projects. Most projects were receiving 30% of the approved cost of the project. Renewable energy projects were receiving 75% of the approved cost. specifically related to renewable fuel source being used. And consolidation projects, 50% of approved costs, CTEs, 50% of approved costs. So you can see here how varying those particular percentages can incentivize districts to take on particular kinds of projects. So fluctuating the numbers can affect the particular educational vision that you have for the state. So this is another big policy lever. So just to recap some of the points, your eligibility conditions are a huge policy lever that you have. That's the funnel to get things in the door to talk about who can receive dollars. Your prioritization talks about when someone can receive dollars. So that's another big lever that you can pull. And then the actual particular award, the aid that you provide, is another big policy lever. These are all ways that you guys, even not administrating the program, even if it's operating through these entities, can have a big say in the kinds of projects that would happen across the state. And just to call out the last piece, eligible costs, only portions of a project meeting space and cost parameters adopted by rule are eligible for construction aid. State aid percentages are only of that approved cost. So it's not for the full value, and fluctuating those eligibility conditions, not even, I should be clear, there's eligibility conditions for your project to get in the door, that's the funnel. And then there's eligible cost parameters, and that's the amount to which award is made available. So those are yet another policy lever that you can have, and those are currently built out in state Board of Education rules. I'm sorry.
Senator Williams.
Thinking back, when was this?
Started in the 90s.
Okay. So I'm thinking about Burlington High School. For the construction that they went through, they fit into this category, or how did they obviously didn't fit through the funnel, but.
So I don't know the years in which they pursued their project, but if this is a recent project, it would not have gone through Chapter
Okay.
123, and this would have just been handled in the way that districts are currently handling, which is voting locally on that bond, and then it's having impacts on the ed fund and raising tax rates essentially across the state. So if it's anywhere since 2007, which I'm assuming that it is,
Yeah, it is.
then it would not have gone through this track.
Okay.
Other conditions just to call out, these are quite meaningful, but sort of less meat of the program. Repayment as a condition of aid. So the school district, if they decided to sell off a project that had been funded with state aid, they would have to refund a particular percentage, so up to the construction aid received, provided that amount wouldn't exceed the actual amount they received in aid. So the percentage amount at the sale point up to the cap of the aid that they actually received in dollars. Emergency aid, as we've discussed, emergency aid is persisted throughout the moratorium. Secretary provides that determination up to a total project cost of $100K. State board is the entity that's authorized to undertake rulemaking for the school construction program. Again, just drawing out this dual set of duties, which is sort of an odd piece of the current environment, and also thinking about I'm recalling from discussions in the working group that was addressing school construction, I believe the state board came in and testified as to sort of capacity to handle particular pieces of this. So it's nice to think about in the current environment, even if you were just trying to turn on the existing program, whether existing technical capacities at the relevant parties have changed in the intervening years, such that they might not be able to handle their responsibilities at this point. But just something you would need to check if you were thinking about kicking this back on or transforming the system. There is an appeal piece of this. So if a school district is aggrieved by an order, they think that they should have received aid under this program, they're allowed to appeal to their local superior court within 30 days. And then crucially, we talked about this piece, there's a deferred maintenance constraint on the existing program, applies not just to emergency aid, it applies to the chapter as a whole. No aid is available to projects where the secretary finds the need for the project has arisen from significant deferred maintenance. And again, I think it's likely, but I'm guessing that that's going to impact many schools at this point. Many school facilities would have needs arising from significant deferred maintenance. So that is the current law. In 2021, you guys required the Agency of Education to conduct a facilities assessment. And then in 2023, created the School Construction Aid Task Force. That is the report that I think you guys have printed out. I think the report, just my own personal opinion, is there's a lot of great information in there, and it takes some pretty firm stances on issues. Some pieces that the task force recommended was centering the efficient use of public funds to modernize school infrastructure in alignment with current educational needs. So not just remedying defective facilities, but trying to meet these, to tie these up to educational standards and needs. To use policy levers, eligibility, prioritization criteria, assurance certification to drive funding toward desired projects. We've talked kind of broadly throughout this presentation about that, trying to note when you can pull policy levers to drive funds to particular kinds of projects, how you can implement a kind of educational vision through this program. Good implementation should prioritize decisions that enshrine continuity of financial and technical resources in law. This is really a stability concern. This is making sure that school districts know what's going on in the space and they aren't having to confront a new environment every year. There's some predictability, there's some continuity, but obviously it is difficult in this environment of immense uncertainty and transformation in the education system as a whole. And then lastly, recommended access to school construction funds must include CTE centers. So that was something that the task force came out with. Finally, the task force also recommended the creation of the working group. They wanted to engage in a longer planning process. So this led to the working group that worked this past summer. And the legislative members of those working groups, including Senator Weeks, have introduced a bill in each chamber, S39 and H129. And just quickly before I turn this over, we don't have to talk through the language of this bill. I'm sure you guys will have me back for this piece if you have the appetite to go down this road. But just to call out, the proposal in S39 establishes a new state aid program that's exclusively housed within the Agency of Education. So trying to get rid of this competing responsibility list. Review, rulemaking, and the annual construction funding request would be assigned to the agency. Stands up a time-limited advisory board to function as a public-facing advisory check on the agency, but this would be purely advisory. This would just be checking in on the Agency of Education. Creates a special fund that awards aid to school construction projects, grants through the facilities master plan grant program, funding for administrative costs and emergency aid. It builds a similar two-step approval process modeled on existing section 3448 with added eligibility conditions and tasks the agency with adopting rules to establish new priorities. And crucially, we talked about the bonding portion of this. It awards aid in the form of a debt service subsidy at a base amount of 20% of eligible costs with up to an additional 20% award available in the form of bonus incentives. So to explain this, the concept, the way of avoiding impacts for state bonding capacity is to have municipalities bond through the Vermont Bond Bank and then have the state come back and provide funds to pay interest and principal payments on that bond over its lifetime, so lifetime costs of the bond. The working group didn't identify a particular revenue source, so there's still a question as to what this would be, but essentially funds would go to a special fund to pay out these awards, and then over the course of that bond, you'd have a base amount of 20%, and if a project met additional bonus incentives that are spelled out in rule by the Agency of Education, for which this board would advise, then a project could receive particular additional increments of aid. And this would be yet another huge policy lever you could pull to drive funding to certain kinds of projects. And we've talked about this a bunch. Policy levers, eligibility conditions, who can access state funds. We talked about current law hinging on meeting particular needs, that it's narrowly tailored to fit that project. The new proposal, S39, proposes new eligibility conditions related to consolidation, district quality standards, and the facilities master planning process. So things to think regionally about school construction projects. Another policy lever, your prioritization points, who has first access to those state funds, and then bonus incentives. What kinds of projects does the state want to incentivize through additional aid? And with that, that's overview of school construction. I'm happy to come back on other pieces, but I know that Chris has some big fiscal pieces to speak to here. But happy to take questions from you guys.
Are you staying?
I can say, for sure.
Why don't we do any immediate questions? So are you planning to stay?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
that's totally fine.
Okay, then why don't we switch it?
Sounds good.
Looks legible. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Roop. I'm Associate Fiscal Officer over in the Joint Fiscal Office. I hardly ever visit this committee because even though I spent a lot of my life in school, I know very little about education. I do, however, spend a lot of time in the money committees, the revenue raising committees, the appropriations committees, and in a previous life, spent a lot of time staffing the transportation committees. So I'm coming at this issue less sort of immediately focused on the issue of schools and a little more big picture on some money considerations that you all should keep in mind as it relates to school construction. A lot of what I'm going to talk about isn't unique to school construction. There's sort of broader philosophical considerations you all should have in mind, but I'm trying to sort of translate the way some of your colleagues on the money committees view some of these issues to try to help you all in your process. And I think I'm going to apologize in advance to Senator Weeks because he could probably give my slides for me at this point because he's heard this a few times. And one of the slides that I'll refer to as the talk is something that I often have to give to committees regardless of the issue, and it'll just be tailored to school construction today. So I'm just going to touch on a few quick things here and build on what John had mentioned, and also some of this will inform how you view the legislation that's been introduced. The report that was distributed from AOE, I am not going to talk about, but it is an excellent resource, and I would encourage you all to take some time to go through it. They even have some pro forma debt service schedules out there that give you a sense of, you know, if somebody was going to go and borrow $100 million and the state were to subsidize 20% of that, broadly speaking, like what does that look like in terms of costs? So it's a really, really good report. AOE and the treasurer spent a lot of time on it, and I would encourage you all to take a look at it. So, you know, I just really at the bottom, you know, sort of the bottom line up front, trying to summarize the major issues here, that when we're talking about state aid for school construction, what we're really talking about is coming up with a system to shift some of the costs of eligible construction activities off of the property tax. That's really what we're talking about here under current law. As John had mentioned, the previous iteration of school construction aid, which is still in Title 16, funded this program through the capital bill using general obligation debt. There has been, as John noted, a moratorium for more than a decade on this aid program with just a nominal amount programmed in the capital budgets for emergency repairs, like $50,000 a year, something like that. Why this conversation really came up with renewed vigor is that the capital bill is significantly constrained fiscally, so it is unlikely to be a viable path forward for restarting a state aid for school construction program. The Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee, CDAC, which offers a recommendation on how much the state should borrow in general obligation debts, has recently reduced its recommendation from $54 million a year to $50 million a year for this biennium. So given what's going on with construction writ large, the fact that they reduced that bonding recommendation, which the legislature has never exceeded, just further emphasizes the fact that we need to find another path forward. I do want to note that states do continue, or excuse me, not states, schools do have the ability to keep doing construction work in the absence of a state aid program. And Burlington is a good example of that. But the impact right now is if a school goes out to bond and pursues a project, those costs fall to the ed fund into property taxes by default. So this red line is kind of scary. That the big takeaway from that report that I just mentioned is that the estimated cost to replace like with like would require a sustained annual investment of like $300 million a year for the next 20 years. The working group that convened over the summer and fall took testimony that number is likely understated. So I think this just reinforces the fact that finding the money to replace like with like is going to be a heavy lift.
I don't quite understand that phrasing. That's not deferred maintenance. That's if we replaced every school facility in the state with a new one.
So I didn't do the analysis. I would
Okay.
suggest you have AOE.
It's just a weird
come
way
in.
of saying.
Well, it's to not shrink the footprint, I would say.
Okay,
So like if you were to replace the same, roughly number of facilities and deal with all of the issues that have been identified in the current portfolio of buildings.
okay, but new construction or,
Yeah.
Can I interject?
okay,
It's, so we did the, facilities assessment,
yeah,
find out the actual condition of schools, and it's all those costs rolled up.
okay,
Then projected out 20 years.
okay.
Okay, so if
That's
someone's got a boiler
Mm-hmm,
now, but it's 15 years old and it's gonna hit
Mhm.
5 years from now, theoretically, it's really not like for like, it's condition-based response.
got
I
it.
would agree with that. And I would say the nuance is it's not making assumptions that if you make $20 million of work in one facility, you could then avoid maybe $30 million of improvements in other facilities that you might not have to make if you were to consolidate. So like it doesn't reflect strategic decisions.
I see what you're
Let
saying.
me rephrase that.
Yeah,
It's all current school conditions.
Yeah.
right, it's neutral on, or there is no consolidation involved is why they're saying like with line.
Current footprint.
So taking the existing physical plan
Yep.
and keeping it.
It reflects their
Structurally
assessment of the
sound.
current,
Okay.
current situation. That's a great way of putting it, yeah.
Yeah.
AOE did a really extensive job with their facility condition assessment, and they put an index tool together and everything else.
So Senator Heffernan and Kayla.
No,
Oh, okay.
I'm just pondering it all.
So, Chris, Mike, just to get a sense of the order of magnitude here, what are we spending now on debt service? We have, the 300 million, how does that compare to?
Oh, I mean, for the
Roughly what?
state's general obligation for the capital bill is in like the high 70 million range of annual debt service. And we have, in the ballpark of around 600 million or so of GO debt outstanding.
So I just want to make sure I understand any differences in how does this fall under Brigham the exact same way as dollars for student outcomes?
I am not an attorney. I am not one to ask about Brigham.
Okay, so is there a different path that communities take for funding school construction that has more or less flexibility than the path they take to do their school budget? Like if they have a bond, I guess I'm trying to understand how we think about equity in terms of facilities.
Sure.
Is that
You
it?
should feel-
Okay.
You're kind of here, so you feel it.
So, I have not heard facilities questions in the context of Brigham, but I certainly get the thinking behind it, which is that if facilities have an impact on educational opportunity,
Hugely, yeah,
why wouldn't that affect the analysis?
right.
As to your question about equity concerns within that space, obviously the way that the current system addresses this is by trying to equalize taxing capacities across
Mhm.
districts so that schools are able to undertake these pieces. But as recent years have shown, only particular districts feel that they have the capacity to actually do that, even if those funds are raised statewide. They're saying, we still can't bond on this because we're not willing to take the local raising rates. So I don't know if that's a happy answer, other than to say we have a system that attempts to equalize taxing capacity that can address school construction projects, but has clearly shown itself. Districts have clearly expressed that they don't always feel capable of undertaking the projects.
Right.
And that could conceivably have an effect on
Yeah.
educational.
Okay, I have a policy direction in my head, but I wanted to make sure it was based on the same understanding.
All right. I just want to do a quick money 101 on the next couple slides. Often people see dollar signs and they think money is the same. Money is not the same. There is a distinction between funding and financing that's really important to keep in mind in the world of capital investment. Funding is quite simply is providing more money to address an issue. It's like going into the budget and appropriating, $10 to go do something that you didn't have $10 to do before. Financing, on the other hand, is not necessarily making new money available. You're restructuring your future cash flows in order to advance them and make them available to spend today. Generally, funding is required to pay back financing. It's like purchasing something on a credit card and then having to pay that back. Something you really want to keep in mind is that financing typically has a cost. It's not free money. It's not more money. You do have to pay interest on that. However, there's sometimes benefits to bonding and doing financing because construction projects tend to cost more over time. Facilities, not unlike roadways and bridges, are always deteriorating over time and need to be replaced. And it is often cheaper in the long run to borrow money and do it now rather than sort of kick the proverbial can down the road and defer and wait till things get worse and get more expensive. There's another big advantage on that sort of dovetails with the equity piece that whenever you've got a facility that's going to provide benefits to multiple generations, an argument can be made that it is equitable to space the cost of that out over multiple generations who are going to use the asset and not just have the current generation fund 100% of the cost. Something to keep in mind, though, is that like with anything, when you're borrowing money, it is a tool. You can manage it or it can manage you. And, the downside to committing your future cash flows is you're inherently giving up a little bit of your budget flexibility in future years. So pivoting over to funding. Funding, like I said, is really about providing more money to address an issue. And there's several ways the legislature does this all the time. You reallocate existing resources. You can put new taxes in or higher taxes than you currently have. You can just make appropriations or grants from your existing resources through the budget. You do that all the time. The appropriators often think about funding through two really important lenses. One is distinguishing one-time costs versus base costs. One-time should ideally be used for non-recurring expenses, and recurring funds should also be, if you've got a base expense that's expected to just continue on in perpetuity, you don't want to use one-time funds to pay for that. You want to use recurring funds. You also want to think about, in the context of revenue sources, this concept of stability versus volatility. Not all of our revenue streams behave the same way. Corporate income, personal income, property transfer tend to be some of the most volatile revenue sources, whereas property taxes are among the most stable revenue sources. One of the things that's really important to keep in mind as a legislature is that you can mitigate some of that volatility by having a diversity of revenue sources. So if you look at the revenue streams that go into the general fund, the T fund, the ed fund, some are more volatile than others. And that's how you mitigate some of that risk, is don't put all your eggs in one basket, if you will. So, like I mentioned with financing, it's a tool. It's got to be paid back through future funding. And some of the tools that are in that toolbox are the fact that schools can take advantage of lower tax-exempt interest rates as governments. And we fortunately have the Vermont Bond Bank that offers a really efficient avenue for schools to access that tax-exempt bond market. Going to market can be pretty complicated if you don't have to do it on a regular basis, if you're a small entity. And the bond bank provides a really convenient way for relatively smaller issuers to pool their needs into sort of one big bond issue and have some of that technical capacity dealt with at a more centralized level. I'd mentioned that the state GO bonding is greatly constrained. That recommendation was lowered from 54 million a year to 50 million a year. The working group did take a look at very briefly the concept of revolving loans, which could be an alternative means of borrowing. But there's a lot of questions out there that make you sort of wonder if that is going to be an appropriate tool to really solve this problem, because a revolving loan fund, the real advantage is it can help meet an unmet credit need with a lower interest rate sometimes. But is there an unmet credit need right now? Are there barriers that are in place that are prohibiting schools from accessing the muni bond market? If you do set up a revolving loan fund, you need to think about where the initial capital is going to come from to seed it. And obviously the trade-offs you have are, the longer time horizon you have on something like that, the more slowly the fund revolves and the bigger interest rate discount you provide. Again, does that have a similar impact, but you're not keeping up as much with construction costs and buying capacity moving forward. The working group also explored very briefly an emerging trend of public-private partnerships, or P3s. Prince George's County, Maryland, just pursued one of the first big examples of this in the public school space, where they partnered with a private entity and entered into an agreement where the private entity delivered a bundle of school projects more quickly and more cheaply, or less expensively, than the school district felt they could through conventional construction means. And the way these systems typically work is you have a long-term financial arrangement with this partner. They will then build the school and operate it for a period of time for you and maintain it in exchange for a payment. And it's almost like a rent payment that you would make to use the facility. Things to keep in mind, though, is that a P3 has to make money. They're not doing this out of charitable goodness. So there needs to be an opportunity to earn a return. It is way too soon to tell whether this would be a viable path forward for Vermont at scale. Typically, when an entity is interested in exploring this, they would hire a consulting firm to help them sort of get the lay of the land and see what makes sense or not. But since this is an emerging model out there in Prince George's County, and the working group did take a little bit of testimony on it, I wanted to bring it to your attention as well. It's something that could be out there, but we don't know yet.
Was that specific to education, or was that?
In Prince George's,
Yeah.
they did it specific to education. These models have been in place in other aspects of the public sector for years, but you haven't traditionally seen it in public schools until pretty recently, and that's the most prominent example.
Wouldn't this be pretty much exactly what most college campuses are doing now with dormitories? I mean, at UVM is doing this with Redstone. It's
similar, yeah.
So they're essentially offering their land.
That's one model that could be used.
Yeah.
There needs to be some exchange of value for it to work. There have also
Right.
been some states, my home state, did it in the transportation space with bundling a lot of really small, simple bridges. And rather than go out and go through the normal forecourt bidding process, they hired a private partner, said, we want you to do these 100 bridges and maintain them for the next 20 years. And this is how we're going to pay you to do it. So it's a way of, the real advantage to P3s is if there's some efficiency that they can realize that the government entity can't realize through their traditional means of delivering a project.
Right. I think like the New York, New Jersey path is the largest non-elected transfer of goods and GDP, like daily or something. A lot of this in transportation is a more privatized entity running something that doesn't have an elected body, but functions pretty well.
So the legislation that has been introduced in both bodies and what the working group worked on, and you'll see also in that AOE report from about a year ago, is took a look at a model that Rhode Island uses to subsidize the debt service payments that John alluded to. So the current program in the books that we've had the moratorium on worked a little differently, because not only did the state do the borrowing, but there were two payments made to the schools. They got half the money up front and then half when the project was completed. The debt service model works a little differently, and it sort of, due to our unique funding system under current law, it incorporates, if it were to apply to Vermont, elements of both funding and financing. So the school would be the entity that goes and secures the financing by borrowing funds. And then the state would give a grant to those schools to pay a portion of their annual debt service costs. So that would be interest plus principal. And that would be, payments going out over 20 or 30 years to the school. Something to keep in mind about why this is a weird hybrid under our current system is because the ed fund is expenditure driven, not revenue driven. So the future revenues to pay back that financing sort of automatically get, for lack of a better word, sort of automatically get raised on the property tax under current law. So more funding inherently enters that equation to pay those debt service commitments. The relief, if you will, and the value of a state aid program would be that the portion that's subsidized would be picking up costs that would otherwise fall to the property tax by default. So it's a way of taking some of those costs and funding it through some alternate means. But there is an open question of where is that non-property tax revenue going to come from in order to pay for those debt service subsidy grants. So this is my lead into the part that I call the talk. Something I think to be mindful, and this is not exclusive to school construction, but I work for the entire legislature. So it is part of my job to remind everybody of these core principles because I think they're really important to maintaining the power and authority of the legislature and your ability to do what you need to do. The annual budget process is really the best opportunity you all have to assess needs and priorities against available resources. And those needs and priorities evolve over time, especially as the economic situation might change. Ask any legislators who were around during the Great Recession how that was relative to having to govern and make choices in an environment like this where we've actually had some money. So the budget process, it's just really important to know that regardless of how you feel about any one item in the budget, the process itself is really, really important because that is how you as a legislature assess and set your priorities. And the annual budget, the big bill, is the bill that passes every year that moves money around, it appropriates funds, it transfers money between the funds. That is how you set those priorities and how you make them real. A quick overview of the process is that the governor will recommend a budget each January for the upcoming fiscal year. We call that the GovRec. He did it last week. The legislature will then take a look at that bill. They will make changes, and it is typically the last bill you all pass in May, right before session ends. There are other money bills that float out there, like the capital bill and the T-bill. They focus on authorizations, but they don't actually provide the money to fund the things that they're authorizing. They're giving the permission. But the big bill, the budget, that's what provides the appropriations. That's the spending authority. That's giving the money and making it available to actually fund the things that are authorized to be funded. You all are going to be seeing the Budget Adjustment Act shortly. House Appropriations just introduced it today. That is an opportunity to amend the big bill mid-fiscal year and make some true-ups. And at the end of the year, which happens after June 30th, if there's money left over that wasn't spent, the balance can either carry forward into the next year for the same intended purpose, or it can be reverted back to the fund that it originally came from and then be made available for reappropriation. So if you revert an appropriation, it's no longer available to a department to spend until you all reappropriate that money. These are just sort of like 101s that are really important to keep in mind when you all see these appropriations bills. And you're also familiar with the yield bill. That's another one of the bills that typically passes right down the end. That's the bill under current law that sets the property tax rates at levels that are sufficient to raise enough money for the Ed Fund to fund the voter-approved school budgets and other expenditures that are made from the Ed Fund. But the yield bill does not typically make many appropriations. So the big bill is called the big bill for a reason. So we're talking about school construction, but I think this slide applies to a lot of conversations that happen around the building, and I sort of call it the talk because I often have to give it in a lot of different contexts that, I think when you're viewing things through the lens of a specific program, you often hear a desire to use a dedicated revenue source to fund that program or that priority. You all as legislators, though, should be really thoughtful about when you create dedicated revenues to fund a specific thing. You should consider the fact that dedicated revenues often do not keep up with the needs of the programs they fund. They can also subject the program to fiscal risk when the revenues are volatile or do not keep up with expectations. You see a lot of this in the judiciary because a lot of their programs and special funds are reliant on surcharges and things like that, which have not kept pace with the needs of the programs that those surcharges fund. Dedicating revenues can also create distance between the program and the appropriations process that I tried to stress the importance of on the prior slide. It's very easy for appropriators to say, you know what, they've got their revenue source. I'm going to focus our limited time on these things instead. And when you create that distance from the appropriations process, it can really hinder the legislature's ability to assess and set priorities, and also hinder the ability to sort of make the case if a program needs additional money. It's sort of removing a program from having the audience of justifying its use of existing funds sometimes and saying, hey, these are all the great things we're doing with the money we're getting, but this is why we need more. Perhaps most importantly, dedicating revenues has the effect of prioritizing something over everything else. And if you are championing a program, that might sound very appealing, but we also need to be mindful of the big picture. And the fact that if you're adding inflexibility to the budget process, you're hindering future legislatures' ability to manage the state's finances in response to evolving conditions. And my final bullet point number 5 is somewhat self-serving. Dedicating revenues is really administratively burdensome from an accounting and a revenue forecasting perspective. The consensus revenue forecast that we base our budget around focuses on revenues that flow through the 3 major funds of state government. It does not focus on every little tiny revenue source out there that goes to all these little pots of money. So for lots of reasons to help you all set priorities and manage the state's finances, it is advantageous to have revenues flow through those 3 major funds where they're captured in the revenue forecast. So you all then have a complete picture and can more effectively set priorities. There are perhaps other ways to provide stable funding to a program that you care a lot about, though, without some of the drawbacks that come with dedicating revenue sources. I did, and I'm going to talk about some of them, but I also wanted to flag that not just throwing cold water completely on the idea of dedicated revenues. I'm saying think really carefully. There are times and places where dedicated revenues might make sense. You often see this in the world of fees, where there's a nexus between who pays and who benefits. When I buy my trout fishing license, it goes to Fish and Wildlife, and they use it to stock the streams, for example. It can also be helpful for ensuring that funds are available for complying with long-term regulatory mandates. So the thing that comes to mind is the Clean Water Fund, where the state had a need to commit to a multi-decades process of making sustained investments to comply with regulatory mandates. And if you create a system where you know that there's going to be some money going in there for decades to deal with something like that, perhaps that can be advantageous. Another example exists in the transportation space with borrowed funds. The legislature has something called TIB bonds, which we currently don't have any outstanding, but in the past, you all created a way for the state to borrow money without it adversely impacting the GO bond limit that applies to the capital bill. And the way you did that was by creating a dedicated revenue source that's 2% assessment on gasoline and 3 cents a gallon on diesel that go into a separate little fund. And that fund is used to pay the debt service on TIB bonds. So that way the TIB bonds are sort of held outside of that CDAC process, and it wasn't held against our bonding limit.
Well, you got my attention. TIB, T-I-B?
Yeah, transportation infrastructure bonds. There used to be 3 issues of TIB bonds that were issued in 2009, 2011 or 12, or maybe 2013. The legislature paid off all of those bonds early about 2 years ago due to some one-time COVID money that was unprecedentedly flexible. But that really helped the transportation budget because it freed up $2.5 million to fund on projects on a pay-as-you-go basis rather than paying off debt service. So one option to try to fund these things while avoiding some of the pitfalls of dedicated revenue sources is creating a special fund as an accounting mechanism for managing the funds and retaining interest on those funds within the program if you all specify. This language was in the two bills that were introduced, and there are over 300 special funds. Some have dedicated revenues, most do not. They're an accounting tool. And the legislature every year can transfer money into a special fund or out of a special fund. It can authorize expenditures out of a special fund. But at the end of the day, you're creating a separate bucket from an accounting purpose that puts some guardrails around intended uses of money and provides some transparency around exactly how much is going into that special fund every year in the budget, how much is going out to pay for school construction. It could be an avenue for funding the administrative costs as well. And if there's a sizable balance in there that is waiting to be distributed to schools for their debt service grants, you could have an opportunity to earn some significant interest on there that could help defray some of those administrative costs if you specify. The question of where the money will come from obviously is going to have to be resolved at some point. I can't make $300 million a year just materialize out of thin air as much as you all wish I could. But some of the options could be you could transfer funds from other funds using your existing revenues. The budget does that all the time. You could transfer money from other funds from a new revenue source in a fixed amount each year if you were to decide to do that. You could make contingent transfers of year-end revenue surpluses. Oftentimes, if revenues are trending in a good direction near the end of the budget process, and April is the most significant month for the personal income tax. So we don't really have a really clear sense on how the year is going to end until we start getting collection data in early May. So what the legislature has customarily done is if things look like they might be $100 million above forecast at the end of the year, you will often build out a contingent appropriation list in the budget that says, if revenue, out of any revenue surplus, these things get funded in this priority order. And this could be a logical thing to add of a use to add for year-end surpluses, because this is one of those issues that I think could consume every dollar that could be available to it, just given the scale of it. And in the past budgets, you've seen things like additional money for housing. You've seen money reserved for federal infrastructure match, things of that nature, as items that you'd see on that contingent list at year end. This could perhaps be a similar use for that. I had mentioned see prior slide on the issue of dedicated revenue sources. It's up to you all if you wanted to do that and dedicate it directly in, but I just caution you. How to fund it is ultimately a legislative decision, and the details of how things will move will ultimately depend on where the money comes from. And what I mean by that is, if you were to make a decision to pay for school construction aid through existing general funds, it probably makes sense to have a transfer every year in the budget from the general fund to that special fund. It could be a minimum amount set in statute every year, or it could be a dynamic number based on evolving budget needs, or both. If you were to broaden the sales tax to cover, fiscal analysis service for the legislature, and that money would flow to the ed fund by default, it might make sense to put a transfer from the ed fund to the special fund in a dollar amount that's roughly commensurate with the amount of new money you're raising through broadening the sales tax, for example. If you were to change personal income tax, it might make sense to transfer the equivalent amount from the general fund. My point here is, let's try to avoid splitting up revenue sources in a really funky way, where perhaps it might make more sense to have a straight transfer from the major fund where the revenues go into the special fund. And something that's not on my slides, but it's really important to be mindful of, and I should have mentioned it when I was talking about the budget process, is the bills that you saw introduced on this topic specifically require that AOE submit a funding request for school construction as part of the development of the governor's recommend budget every year. So legislators who have been around a while will tell you how difficult it is to take the GovRec budget and then try to put a many multi-million-dollar new thing into it. It is much easier to get a funding request incorporated in the budget development process at the front end. So that language would stipulate that just like any other agency that is submitting their budget requests, a school construction budget request would be submitted by the agency to the governor's office to be put in the GovRec budget.
So I'm being a wise guy with this, but, you know, we want to go to Mars too, but we're not rocket scientists. So, you know, we need a team to set the policy for all the fiscal issues that you're talking about, and we're not qualified to do it. So, you think, you are?
I mean, I
You're on the finance committee.
right, well, I don't know if we're getting into a discussion or I can wait, but I just think there's only one answer to this. But we can, I mean, I don't want to leave people in suspense here. I did have a question just about, how we would, I mean, I think it feels like a bigger undertaking than I've ever been involved in to consolidate the ownership of all of this existing physical plant into 5 districts, let's say. But I think that the main reason we would do 5 or 6 or some smaller number of districts is that we would give those larger entities governance over the physical plant operations and school construction dollars, and have a larger entity that's making decisions about facilities and operations, and decouple that from the dollars that flow per pupil to student outcomes and personnel, if that makes sense. I mean, that's the only thing I can see the reason to tell people there will be savings in overall efforts to consolidate is if you were giving a larger governance entity a certain amount of dollars and saying, figure out what you need to let go of and what is worth investing in and making regionally available. I just think there's so many interesting questions in terms of how you sell off buildings and how we manage all of that. And I guess that leads to my ultimate conclusion that I think the institutions committee should start to be involved in this long-term question.
So along that line, I was told that the state of Massachusetts has a school building authority.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's a team effort because this is getting so big that.
Yeah. And Ann Manwaring is the one who said this to me on New Year's Day. You know, some of you don't know her, but she was in the House for a long time and was a great thinker on education finance policy. I think she's in the building today. And she said, you know, you have to separate the physical plant and facilities from the kids and the outcomes, or we'll never solve this problem. And I can't stop thinking about that. I think it's the only way forward.
So,
I'm almost done.
Okay.
I'm not going to dwell on this slide. I just wanted to show you the definition and statute of what a special fund is, and also show you an example of one that was recently created. So this language for the technology modernization special fund was largely cribbed into the school construction bills that were introduced. And you can see that, I mean, it's a fairly squishy construct where, you know, you're creating a bucket to hold money, you put the allowable uses in, and you can specify where that money comes from. But it is ultimately up to the legislature to put money in or keep money in or authorize the expenditures out and the allowable uses. But it's an accounting mechanism. So there's just a few other considerations I wanted to raise that these are not necessarily have the solution to all of these, but I just wanted to raise them as things that you might want to keep in mind as this conversation continues is, you know, how will school construction aid, and some of this sort of concludes everything I've been rambling on about too, but how will school construction aid interact with the annual budget process? That first sub-bullet is reflected in the language that was introduced that stipulates that the funding request for school construction aid be submitted to the legislature in the GovRec budget in January. For obvious reasons, it's just a lot easier and preferable for ongoing funding requests to be considered in the early stages of the budget development process. And it's just really hard to accommodate big lifts once the budget's already been put together. You should think about how will program administration costs be funded. Would they either be an allowable use of the special fund or fund it out of the general fund? I believe the language that was introduced makes admin costs an allowable use of the special fund. Think about what activities would it pay for? Planning grants, the debt service subsidy grants, other things. Who administers it? And should they issue rules for how it's used? And what, if any, role would the legislature have in officially authorizing specific projects? So this goes back to what Senator Williams mentioned about the institutions committees, where, what details should the legislature get on what school projects were prioritized and approved? What does that look like? What committees get that information? At what level of detail? And, what is the role of the legislature in that process? I mean, should the legislature be involved in second guessing and reprioritizing, or reviewing what had already been prioritized and understanding why, and holding agencies accountable for implementing your vision? There's just a few other considerations, some of which are more relevant to other committees, but since you all vote on things like the budget, you should be mindful of them too. One big trade-off would be, do you fund these grant awards in full up front? So if your school is going to receive $20 million of total debt service paid out over 20 years, in this model, the legislature would fully fund the $20 million up front, park it in the special fund, let it get interest, and dribble out that money over years. And then the receiving school would have some assurance that their funding award is there, like the money's there to fund it up to several decades out in the future. That obviously would maximize your interest earning potential, which is a little more relevant now in the interest rate environment that we're in. We haven't always been getting 5% on our money, but it's pretty significant right now. Another advantage of sort of funding everything up front is that there's less of a potential to create a backlog over time of unfunded grants. And that was a big issue in the old program, was that there was this backlog that built up, and it took years to sort of pay that down. And in that period of time, schools were held up for getting their aid payments. Obviously, the trade-off, though, is that it limits the amount of new grants you can award each year, because $20 million might buy you one grant in this model, as opposed to buying more if you were to do the second option, which is funding more on like a cash basis, where instead of parking that full 20 million, you would just assume that you would budget $1 million every year. That creates, potential to fund more projects initially, but obviously you're constraining future legislatures. It's not unlike borrowing funds like, GeoDebt, where every time you do it, you're committing future legislators to finding money over the next 20 years to pay that back. There's obviously less potential to earn interest income in that special fund if you have a lower balance sitting there accumulating interest.
Can we touch that for a sec?
Sure.
So I understand the concept of not binding future legislatures. At the same time, we're talking about bonding, which is all about future legislatures. So how do you resolve the tension?
So this is my non-legal answer, because this is a tension that comes up all the time. There's the legal answer, and then there's the practical answer. John gives you the legal answer. I'll give you the practical answer. You may not be able to bind a future legislature in terms of they cannot withstand current law, they can change current law. But you guys in practice bind future legislatures all the time.
Right.
Every time you pass a capital bill, you're binding future legislatures to pay for that. Every time you pass a transportation bill, you are funding next year's expenditures, but you're committing to finishing these projects that are going out over many years. So reality can constrain future legislatures in practice.
Okay, so that's the fiscal answer.
Yeah.
What's the legal answer?
So I agree with that. I mean, when people say you can't bind future legislatures, it's obvious that you do. Any codification of a law is a binding of a future legislature. You can revisit anything, which is, I think, why people raise this point that you can't bind a future legislature. But setting the stage for where the considerations happen, so passing a bond for which you have to raise particular money, constrains the decision-making of the legislature and says, if you don't do this, you're paying a cost for essentially that decision. So I agree, to me, it's a practical point, really. It's that future legislatures can take different decisions than you take today, but they make them within the context that you set up for them. So I agree.
So do you see the 300 million as, let's say $300 million did fall out of the sky. Do you see that as a revolving loan fund, or that would all have to be put in and never recouped?
So I wouldn't even talk about the $300 million number because as you'll see at my final point is there's no magic obvious way to raise that amount of money. And if you don't believe me, you can look at the charts from the revenue forecast at the very back. The way I see it is, a $300 million is the total need that was identified to replace like with like, but it was indifferent as to where that money would come from and how much would be borne by the school versus the state share of the aid program.
But I don't know. So I don't know if we're seeing things the same way, because from the last few presentations we've had, there's $300 million there. I mean, they are showing us.
Where's $300 million?
So they're showing us how much we raise on the property tax now. Mm-hmm. Then showing us if we went to a foundation formula model, you are scaling back how much you give the top spending districts. So they ultimately, when they did their math, they had $180 million of quote unquote savings, right? So you start with that $180 million, and then you look at some of the other places they were putting funding, like transportation, 25 million, et cetera. And I could be understanding this incorrectly, but you start to be able to tell a very different story that we could send communities, and then you say you take $1,000 out of the per pupil payment that was going to go to maintenance and operations, and you say, okay, here's your per pupil allotment, but there's essentially $300 million in what we discussed budgetarily, and I'd love to run the numbers on this, that you wouldn't have to give out per pupil, but you could use in the existing dollars that we raise in the education fund to fund school construction and deferred maintenance.
How, if I can just ask a clarifying question, how are you getting 300 million from the 180 million that's being proposed?
Because
I'm missing that part.
Because, okay, so, and again, I'm not saying it's exactly 300 million, but you start with 180 million that was supposedly saved. They plowed some of that back in as 25 million to transportation, et cetera. There were other places they put some of the money that I would count as facilities and operations. Baked into the 1.6 billion, I want to say, whatever, baked into the per pupil amount was $1,000 per student for maintenance and operations, which I don't think is enough on its own, but that's a different story. So say you took that $1,000 out of the per pupil amount you gave and put it back into this larger pot of money that's distributed equally among the districts for facilities, operations, and school construction, you'd still have ongoing operations costs for the district. So it wouldn't be 300 million that could just go into deferred maintenance and physical plant, but those districts could make decisions about this building's too far gone, and we're, over the next 2 years, we're changing some of the calculations there, and you're completely separating out the money you give those districts for facilities and operations and physical plant. And I would think that if you went back through that appropriation sheet, you could essentially find about $300 million that's devoted to physical plant instead of students and student outcomes.
Can I poke at this
Yeah,
from a
yeah.
slightly different direction? So first off, I think these guys, the AOE in their analysis used a figure somewhere between, I don't know, 4 and 7% of facilities footprint to determine what an annual maintenance budget should be. Okay, so that's one bit. The other bit is 300 million is really, we're talking about funding 20, 25, whatever percent. So that's 60 million. Of that, you still have to consider that, let's say 75% of the schools survive consolidation. That's just theoretical, hypothetical. That's 45 million. So you really, the grand scheme, we're not really trying to look for 300 million. We're trying to look for like 45 million.
Right, which could just be its own line item in the savings that were found in that other appropriations proposal. But I actually think it's a real carrot to the district consolidation process to put more money in to help transition those other buildings to other uses in those communities. I mean, to really fill the pot and revitalize our physical plant with those dollars.
Well, we were meeting today with this discussion to
For finance.
set that, well, partially
Yeah.
to set that discussion up in the time comes.
Yeah.
So,
keep
actually, we want to break. We've got 5 minutes before we have our next, guest arriving. So, unless there's any further questions, that this is.
Oh, there's
this is
plenty
a
more.
discussion to be had.
This is the discussion.
Yeah, to be had. But probably hold until when the time comes.
Yeah.
Yeah.